You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm a quintessential millennial. Pre-internet, pre-mobile phone. I grew up in the era of the best music and TV shows. Fight me. When I was in primary school, I received a daily allowance from my parents. This was roughly $1. $1 can't get you much these days, right? But you know what? Back then, it was enough for a meal at recess, maybe a fancy eraser that I didn't really need, but it was pink and it belonged in my pencil case. I found out recently that today's kids have very different spending habits compared to mine. For one, they don't even pay with cash anymore. They get pre-loaded cards that their parents can top up automatically. Or they pay through their smartwatches. I didn't even get mine till 10 years ago. And they buy the good stuff. Coffee smoothies with a green Medusa logo, sports attire with a swoosh, and they want the latest smartphone for Christmas. Now, anyone can argue that these Gen Alpha kids born anytime after 2010, that they're just a product of their generation. So the question is, how do parents make them understand the value of money? Hopefully, my next guest on the Money Talks podcast has some tips. Let's get clued in by Michelle Howell, a licensed representative under Synergy Financial Advisors. She's also a financial coach with Frolic for Life. So Michelle, are you a mom to a Gen Alpha?
I certainly am. I've actually got 2 Gen Alpha children.
Wow, not one but 2. Did they come as a set?
They're aged 10 and 13.
Okay. Okay, so how much pocket money do you give them a week and in what form?
So for my 13-year-old, and he's expected to pay and budget himself for his food, or extra snacks, transport, entertainment with his friends. So as a 13-year-old, we give him $25 a week, which he needs to budget. And then the younger one, the 10-year-old, he gets about $10.
$10 a week.
Yes.
Okay.
Because he doesn't catch public transport on his own. And so it really depends on the needs of the particular child. In terms of pocket money, there is a growing recognition that the earlier our children start to learn good money habits, then the more financially capable they will become as adults. So giving your child pocket money provides the perfect opportunity to discuss money and to teach your child good financial habits at home. It also allows them to explore and make their own mistakes when there is really not a lot at stake. So how much pocket money and when you give it will depend on your family circumstances and your values. So you can base your decision on how much to give, on what household chores you expect your child to do, what your family budget will allow, how old your child is. So for example, you might give a 5-year-old $5 per week and a 7-year-old $7 per week. You can also take into account what you expect the pocket money to pay for. So, for example, if you expect it to cover things like transport, lunches and savings, then you might need to give them a little bit more. So paying your children to do chores around the house is a complex issue. and no single rule is right for every family.
Sure.
So some families feel that everyone should help with chores just because you're a member of the family. And some families may have helpers that cover all the chores at home and prefer not to have the children involved in cleaning up. On the other hand, some families feel that pocket money should be earned and not given. So personally, in our family, we link pocket money to regular chores like tidying the room, helping to set the table and clear away after meals. We also offer the opportunity to earn more for additional chores like washing the car.
Yeah. And you give this pocket money in cash, or is this like that top-up card that I talked about? Because that's what I'm hearing my friends giving their kids.
Okay, so that is a really good question.
Yeah.
Because this generation is, and if I can digress a little bit and talk about Gen Alpha, because Gen Alpha as a generation, they are born between 2010 and currently 2024. And interestingly, Gen Alpha being the youngest generation is projected to become the largest generation in the history of the world.
Wow.
With more than, I think it's about 2.8 million people born weekly.
So there's going to be a lot of money in that.
Yes. And they'll shape the social media landscape, the popular culture influencers, they're the emerging consumers. And by the end of the 2020s, they will be moving into adulthood and the workforce.
Yeah.
So Gen Alpha have the most materially. They're the most technologically savvy generation, and they will enjoy a longer lifespan than any previous generation. So they'll also stay in education longer, start their earning years later, and stay at home with their parents later as well. So the role of parents, therefore, will span a longer age range, with many of these Gen Alphas likely to still be living at home well into their late 20s.
And millennials listening to this are going to think twice, especially if you don't have kids yet. They're going to start thinking twice about whether to have kids or not, because that means I have to live longer for that kid. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so you're a mom to a Gen Alpha. What are Gen Alpha kids into these days?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this generation are part of an unintentional global experiment where screens are placed in front of them
constantly
from the youngest age as pacifiers, entertainers, and educational aids. So this in turn has led to shorter attention spans and the gamification of education.
Yes, everything is gamification for them, right?
Yes, and the way that Gen Alpha learns involves technology, which is very accessible through devices such as smartphones and tablets. So growing up in this environment where digital payments and cryptocurrencies are increasingly common, Gen Alpha may have less tangible experience with physical cash and may struggle to understand the value of money. In my experience, it is important to start conversations about money and financial management at a young age, so as early as 6 to 7 years old. And even at this age, children are exposed to technology. However, I recommend using cash to demonstrate financial concepts.
Okay.
Yeah, so similar,
and that's what you do with your kids. You give them cash.
Yes,
okay,
I do. Yes,
okay.
And because similar to how toddlers require physical toys to develop their fine motor skills, when a young child can physically hold cash and count money, it is easier for them to learn concepts such as budgeting and saving. So, for example, they're able to see physically the benefits of saving by adding coins and notes to a piggy bank and watching it grow.
Yeah, and hearing it. Like
exactly,
hearing the coins hit the ceramic of the piggy bank or the plastic, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, sorry to sidetrack here, Michelle, but do your kids complain that they get old school cash compared to their friends who may get like an auto top-up card and something that's snazzier, like paying with their phones and their watches? Do they complain to you?
Not at the moment. My younger one, definitely not.
Okay.
The teen is starting to ask about cards, and we will actually be introducing cards very soon.
Okay.
So the usual age that I would recommend then introducing a digitized form of money is between 12 to 14 years old. So depending on the particular maturity of the child.
Sure.
Because at this age, they start to own their own mobile phones. So their use of money will become more digitized.
Yeah.
And they may start having access to payment systems via their phones or a debit card, which they can track the balances via an app. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that cash is good and digital is bad.
Sure, yeah.
It's just that increasingly our children need to be equipped to build experience and navigate confidently in a digital world.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this, Michelle, but back in the 90s, it was German-made 2B pencils and quality crayons, maybe a game console to play Super Mario, right? Those were the things that were considered a luxury. Today, and as you rightfully pointed out, a kid wants completely different things. And these tend to be pretty big ticket items because they're just so exposed to it online, through their friends. It's just everywhere, right? Because the adults are holding onto smartphones as well. So you alluded to this a little earlier about how Gen Alphas really think differently about money compared to the rest of us. But what about if I were to compare Gen Alphas with Gen Z? Because Gen Z is a generation that's not too far from them, and they are not pre-internet. They are internet babies, right? So how do we compare Gen Alphas and Gen Zs in terms of how they understand money?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky question because in my mind, so Gen Alpha they have no choice. They were born literally, I think it was 2010 was when the iPad was introduced to the market. So literally the first year of Gen Alpha, the tablets were around, iPads were around.
That's true.
But however, Gen Z, they have had an opportunity to learn without digital. However, they're probably quite young. So I would say that they're probably in the same sort of basket and they are likely to have a similar sort of money mindset and attitude to money.
What kind of examples do you have in terms of how different their understanding and attitudes towards money is, these two generations compared to everyone else?
I would say perhaps some differences would be that maybe with Gen Z, perhaps maybe the parents may not have had as many conversations with them. It is now becoming increasingly, there's more increasing awareness around discussions about financial literacy.
Yeah. And is that because moms and dads are just too busy? They're just working?
I think so, because the parents of Gen Z, so they could have been maybe Gen Xers. And Gen Xers were, a very hardworking generation.
Yeah.
And so they were very focused on paying off the mortgage.
Putting the food on the table.
Yes. And so there may not have been a lot of time or focus and energy that we're able to put to really teaching the children and increasing their financial literacy. And also there probably wasn't as much social media around as well.
I think the most significant aspect about Gen Alphas and their exposure to money isn't money itself, right? We talked about how they are more digital natives, right? And also they have access to online shopping, which is huge today. How's that going to influence the way they spend, save, invest in the future as adults?
This is such a good question, and sometimes a frightening question.
You're telling me.
So it's interesting to note that the sales and marketing strategies of online shopping and online games has shifted from profiting from the initial sale of a video game, which was more in my generation. Maybe we would save to buy Mario Kart or save to whatever the latest Nintendo or the latest Switch game is. But so it's shifted from the initial sale of a video game to revenue being generated from in-game purchases.
Yes.
And many children, including my own, are playing games where in-game purchases can provide a tactical advantage. They may get extra lives, character upgrades, or weapons.
Yes.
And
they just keep teasing you, right?
Yes. And what it does is it provides a lead over players who did not purchase the additional content. And some online purchase can be purely aesthetic, so new dance moves, skins or clothing for their characters.
Exactly.
So another tactic is the use of loot boxes.
Oh.
And so this is where players buy a box without knowing what's inside.
It's a mystery box.
Yes.
Okay.
And it could contain a game-changing item, but more often than not, the prize is nothing more than a mediocre customization for a character. But the loot boxes can create a type of gambling addiction.
Right.
And for children who haven't developed their prefrontal cortex and who are able to think about the risk or weigh up probability and the consequences,
right,
they keep buying and they keep engaging in this type of behavior.
And they don't understand why it is they're doing that. They just know that they need to get the next best thing.
That's right. And while it is easy for adults, particularly in older generations, to criticize and tell the child that they're wasting their money, it's also important to realize the sense of belonging that Gen Alpha may feel when communication is had between the parent and the child. So keep having those open discussions around comparisons between, say, the cost of an in-game purchase and something in real life.
What would you recommend a parent say to the child in this context? How would you do it?
So I would recommend that you talk about the opportunity cost of buying something in a game versus, and maybe that might last 30 seconds, versus something in real life or a real experience.
Right.
So say they buy something that costs $20, like a loot box, and say, okay, what could you have used that $20 in real life to buy? Or perhaps maybe even an experience, and say maybe that can pay for a session of go-karting with your friends, and think about how you'd feel spending time with your friends going go-karting versus spending that $20 on buying that mystery box, which really you don't. What did you get in the end?
Exactly. I think that's an excellent suggestion. You're doing two things here. You're taking them away from that virtual world, which can be quite addictive if they're not watched over. But you're also teaching them a very valuable lesson here about the value of that $20, right?
Yes.
That $20 could have been better spent doing or buying something more meaningful. But at the same time, it's not just about making them understand the value of money, right? Not just about the cash. It's also about the time, the effort, the skill needed to produce something. How do you teach them this? How do you teach them the value of things?
This is where going back to pocket money, which is really important, because then if they are thinking about, if I want to buy this game or this toy, then they have to think they've got a reference point, and they think, okay, if I have $10 a week and I want to buy this $60 toy, then how many weeks do I need to save up, including the expenses that I need to pay for to be able to buy this toy?
So you're teaching them early financial planning.
Exactly.
Budgeting and planning. And I think that's an important skill to teach them as well, because then they can attach value to things, right? So obviously, as a parent, you sometimes cave in to some of their whims and fancies. Any danger signs that parents need to look out for, even teachers can look out for in Gen Alphas, in terms of any bad financial habits they may pick up? How do we know when to intervene as an adult?
First of all, always establish open communication so that you always feel comfortable asking your child, do you have enough money to pay for certain snacks, for transport? How much do you have left in your budget? When your child starts to perhaps hide things from you, or they're not willing to engage in that conversation, then that can be a warning sign. Another one, and this is actually a personal story with one of my sons, he actually became very upset because he couldn't buy something in a game.
Right.
And it actually ended up being that a friend at school said that I'll only be your friend if you buy this for me in the game, or if you give me this in the game. And so he was using his pocket money to try and give something to a friend.
Oh, no.
So there are certain warning signs where there was a disproportionate emotional attachment being put on saving up to buy something in a game, which didn't really fit with, well, that's just usually something, that's it's not that important in a game.
Exactly.
So
there was a deeper root cause.
Yes.
What about when your kids' friends or your own kids start borrowing money from other sources to fund whatever it is that they couldn't afford on their pocket money?
Yes, this is a really difficult one too. And the point of pocket money is to teach the children that you have to budget within these boundaries. But if they're then trying to push the boundaries to then borrow from friends, then it is important to draw a hard line and say, no, that's at this stage, that is not the right way to learn to budget. And again, I think it is important to look for warning signs with friendships and money as well. And the difficulty in monitoring this is that every family has a different set of values and perhaps a different level of monitoring of the kids.
Exactly.
And also different affordability limits. So some families would be happy just to free rein, give whatever money the children ask for, and others are trying to implement a budgeting strategy. So it is a very complex situation to navigate.
Yeah. Overall, maybe give us your top 3 tips in summary of how a parent of a Gen Alpha kid might need to think differently about how to impart financial literacy to them.
For younger kids, creating their own budget can help them to show how to stretch their pocket money beyond small knickknacks and toys to afford bigger items. You're actually teaching them a life lesson. So helping your child to understand this concept early can help them to be more prepared and able to make the distinction between budgeting for essential living costs like rent and saving for bigger items like a car or a house once they're adults. Give them the space to make their own decisions and make mistakes as well. So let them spend their money on those knickknacks until they find that big item that they really want to buy, and then allow them to realize that, okay, if they hadn't spent their money on those little meaningless things, then they could have bought that bigger item sooner. And for younger children, another idea is to decorate jars and label them with their particular savings goals. For example, one jar for maybe snacks, another jar for a bike, and a jar for savings. For teens, you can make them budget for outings with friends. For example, I always ask my 13-year-old, okay, have you saved enough of your pocket money to pay for lunch, a movie ticket, and transport home with your friends? For young adults, you can introduce a budgeting spreadsheet or use some budgeting apps to keep track of what money is coming in and what's going out to gain financial independence. Financial literacy is not a one-time lesson. It's an ongoing commitment to provide continuous opportunities for discussion and hands-on learning.
What if the kids make mistakes? We talked about how we need to give them space to make that financial mistake, right? Buying that extra knick-knack when they didn't really need to. Where then do you come in as a parent?
That goes back to the particular values of the family unit. So if your particular values are, I'm just going to let them throw them in the deep end and they can either sink or swim.
And that's so hard for many parents to do, right?
It is, yes. And it also goes down to parenting style as well. So are you a helicopter parent, or are you, you let them run their race and up to them to make their own mistakes?
Yeah.
The idea with pocket money is for them to make their own mistakes. And really the amounts that you're giving them is not a lot. So if you're talking about sort of low-level mistakes, then my view is let them make their mistakes.
Okay.
Is it for them to make the mistakes when you're talking about $10, $20 a week rather than making their first investment?
Yeah. Now, Michelle, this has been really enlightening. And I'm very sure you've helped out a whole bunch of millennial parents out there.
I hope so.
And Gen Xers having to deal with Gen Alpha's financial demands. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so before we let you go, we have the fun part of the Money Talks podcast. It's called Questions from a Hat. And you see a hat here. No tricky questions, I promise. Only fun ones. So we'll need you to pick something out of this hat, hand it over to me, and I will read it out.
Okay, Here we go.
Okay, Michelle, your mystery question is, what do you, Michelle, spend the most money on?
Oh, that is a tricky question.
How do I answer this as a financial advisor?
This is actually quite tricky for some people. And being not only a mother of 2 Gen Alphas, a financial advisor and financial coach, I also love to shop. So I know that sounds contradictory in terms of the hats that I wear, but so the things that I love to buy, to be honest, it changes.
Sure.
I love to spend money on travel, to be honest, and we've just come back from Greece, and I always love to get something that reminds me of the place that I traveled to.
Sure.
So my biggest expenditure at the moment is on travel, and that's on both family, myself, to give us all these experiences and special family time. And I guess going back in terms of then how do we model good financial habits, I always encourage families to have discussions with their children. Okay, we're going to go on this family holiday. It'll cost X amount on flights. So we'll do the research, have a look online. Okay, flights cost this much per person. Oh, look, and you've turned 13. I have to pay adult fares for you now.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. And then work backwards and say, okay, this is how much we need to spend for us to go to Europe or Japan or wherever, and involve them in that family holiday planning and budgeting. So
yeah, making them understand how we're going to fund all of these activities.
Agreed.
Yeah. All right, listeners. So if you know someone who's a parent or a relative of a Gen Alpha kid, send this episode along to them. And if you have any thoughts or questions yourself about this episode, send us a message. We are all eyes and all ears. The Money Talks podcast, you can catch it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube Music. Do not forget to rate us if you're enjoying the podcast. A big thanks to the team as well. Crispina Robert, Tiffany Ang, Junaini Johari, Joanne Chan, Saya Wind, and Arjun Bala. I'm Andrea Heng. Thanks for listening.